Welcome to BrainTalk, a podcast from Project BrainStorm about the bipolar spectrum. Your hosts are Dr. Jim Phelps, a psychiatrist and author of several groundbreaking books about bipolar, and Sara Schley, author of the memoir Brainstorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum, and co-creator of Brainstorm the Film, coming to you in 2025. Here on BrainTalk, we'll interview new experts each week about their research and expertise within bipolar, and listeners will call in to ask questions. Let's work together to save lives, end the stigma, and create healing for everyone on the bipolar spectrum and those who love them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Phelps, and I'm going to introduce first my esteemed colleague, Sara Schley, who is an expert on many things bipolar, including her own experience of it for many years. She's just a brilliant woman who's gotten this whole ball rolling, and I hope that you will enjoy her company on this podcast as much as I have.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Jim Phelps. I should carry around with me when I'm having a rough day. I am delighted and honored to introduce Dr. Jim Phelps, who's going to be my co-host on this podcast. And Jim is a preeminent mood spectrum expert. He's written groundbreaking books that help us understand that there is indeed a bipolar spectrum, which is going to be a focus of this podcast. And he's had a huge impact on my life personally, because it was Jim's Diagnostic that helped my fifth psychiatrist figure out that I actually had a form of bipolar called bipolar 2. So I consider Jim as one of the guys that saved my life. So I'm very, very grateful to become friends and colleagues with Jim and to have you here as my co-host. Thanks for saying yes.
Absolutely. Sir, I thought we might start out, because our focus is on the whole bipolar spectrum, talking about versions that don't have mania, which is not intuitive for most people. And your experience is a great illustration of that. So I thought we might start with a brief description of what happened to you.
It took me 25 years and 5 psychiatrists to finally get the diagnosis that saved my life that I actually have a form of bipolar. Why was it so difficult for me to be diagnosed with bipolar? Why did it take 25 years? I have a form of bipolar without mania. And most people think that bipolar, sort of by definition, has got this manic piece to it, which is classic highs, all-night sprees, irresponsible behaviors, sexual adventures. And the form of bipolar that I have does not show that extreme mania. In fact, I've learned subsequently that 2 out of 3 people with bipolar actually do not experience mania. And that's really important to understand, because if you've been experiencing severe depression and nothing's working, there's a chance that you may be on the bipolar spectrum that we want to talk about.
I think the other main thing that we want to emphasize is that the predominant experience is depression. It's depression plus this other often very subtle stuff that can be missed, like in your case, missed by 4 psychiatrists, until the 5th came along and said, well, let's look at some other factors that suggest bipolarity, like having a family member who had a very complex mood disorder, like having an early age of onset, where yours started in college.
Right. So that all of those things happened for me. And it was really, Jim, your diagnostic, which included those questions, after I'd had years and years of brutal, incapacitating depressions that every other psychiatrist got wrong. And the 5th psychiatrist, Dr. Pullman, bless him, now in his 80s, he had your book. And so he knew when he saw me to ask these questions, when was your first onset? Well, yeah, it was before age 25. I was 21 in college. And do you have any other family members who've had, mood challenges? Well, yeah, my mother and my grandfather suffered terribly, brutally. And I could tell you their whole story, but I'm 3rd generation at least. And when you did, get depressed, were you ever given an antidepressant? Yes, I was. Did it seem to make you better and then worse? Yeah, much worse. How did you know you're worse? My husband said I was irritable, and I don't have a bad temper, and I had like this triggered temper and other sort of, aggressive tendencies that I don't usually have. And so when he knew that the antidepressant had triggered hypomania, now I know those terms, I didn't then, and he was like, Chuck, we know what you have, and was able to diagnose me in 15 minutes.
So as an example of what we hope to do with this podcast, we can throw in, or I will, information from the psychiatric literature, translated, I hope, into plain English. For example, how long after an antidepressant has started could someone develop hypomania or mania induced by the antidepressant? And I wrote a paper years ago of a patient of mine whose very mixed manic and depressive symptoms began 7 years after she had a great response to an antidepressant. So somewhere between 30 minutes, which one of my patients said,
Wow.
first time I took an antidepressant, I felt like I was shot out of a cannon,
Wow.
to 7 years. So, so that's the kind of thing that we hope to convey in this podcast.
Yeah, and I think what's also cool, Jim, is that you and I, both of us have a passion to help people understand this bipolar spectrum, because if you do get the right diagnosis, your life can go from, hell to a thriving, rich, full life. So we both share that passion, but we come at it from very different perspectives. I come at it from lived experience. I've lived through this. You come at it from 30 years of being a doctor dedicated to helping people who are living through it. So we have, sometimes we don't agree, which is good. We believe in respectful disagreement on this podcast.
I'm interested in having people understand how clearly you had depression that would be recognized as depression, what that was like, and then how we might be able to figure out, without going through 5 psychiatrists, that was bipolar enough to warrant a different treatment.
Yeah, 5 psychiatrists in 25 years, many years of really, really brutal suffering in there that could have been prevented, and that's why I'm passionate about this work. For me, the onset of my first depression, which we later know as bipolar depression, was extremely dramatic because I was a 21-year-old kid. I was a senior at Brown University. I was headed to one of the best medical schools in the country. I had a gang of friends. I played varsity sports. I had a 4.0, very high functioning, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, it was like someone had flipped a switch, and I started, this tailspin from 60,000 feet crashing down to earth, where my brain stopped working. My cognitive capacity, which was very high, all of a sudden I'm not able to do my multiplication tables when at ACE calculus. I'm terrified to leave my room. I don't want to see my friends when I've been very gregarious. I forget how to get to class. I used to ride my bike everywhere on campus, and people were like, there goes Schley again, and now I don't know how to get there. But it was very, very terrifying because there's nothing that I'd ever experienced before of this loss of my brain.
So how long did that first one last?
That first one lasts about 9 months. And
that's
long.
Yeah, that's long. On average, it's more like 2-3 months. At least once this experience of bipolar really gets underway, the episodes tend to be more like 2 or 3 months as opposed to 5 or 6 months, more typical of a so-called unipolar, like plain pure depression.
Mine tend to be about 9 months. And then ironically, when I was given the wrong medications, they would take longer, right?
Oh,
so I got worse with the meds. And I want to be careful about sending that message because I got worse with the wrong diagnosis and the wrong meds. With the right diagnosis and the right meds, it saved my life. So that's why another big point of this podcast is getting the diagnosis right is a matter of life and death.
So when I'm seeing patients, I look forward to seeing people who've had experiences like yours, because it's like, ooh, this could be another one of those folks who can have that tremendous recovery that you've had, to become such a high functioning person again. So it's part of the privilege of doing this work is to be able to see people when they have been having such an awful time, and then watch as when things work, to see this remarkable recovery. And so again, that's why we're doing the podcast. We hope that we can help more people have that experience.
Yeah, and I asked you that once, Jim, because a lot of people that I meet now in this field have some family history. They had a mother or a brother or someone who suffered from bipolar, they themselves, or they lost someone to suicide tragically. And you said, no, you hadn't had that personally, but you had seen, the capacity to help people get really better. And that was so inspiring. And
Right.
and that's, just like that switch flipped on, sent me in a tailspin. It's like it goes in the right direction. You get better if you do the right treatment, and you can get better.
How long did it take when you got on lamotrigine, and we'll talk more about lamotrigine, when you got on it, how long was it before you started to think, oh my gosh?
I'm all better, 3 months. But the reason for 3 months is, as you know, you'd have to titrate up very slowly, so 25 milligrams a week. Before I got to the right doses for me, it was 3 months. But then it was, boom, I was back. Because one of the things that happens when you're in this bipolar depression for me is you cognitively also lose memory. You use word recall. I'm a writer. I've written books now. I couldn't find words to write. It's just horrible on so many levels. So I was out on a camping trip with my buddies who had packed for me and did everything for me because I couldn't do any of that. But I was starting to get better. And we're playing this memory game, this word game. And I started winning the memory game. And my best friend, who's been with me on this journey for 16 months at this point, she starts tearing up. And she says, "You're back."
Wow.
And then I realized I was back because I could also navigate for the group reading a map.
Now, I've seen people, when they start on lamotrigine, start to feel something like this might actually be working, even with the very first dose. It takes a couple months to get up to full speed. But I can imagine after that long 25 years, you would have been dubious of any, oh, is this better? Well, forget it. I'm not going to regard myself as better until something like the camping trip happens.
Yeah.
And you can really see it, which that might have been more like 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah. I was more than dubious. I was really cynical, which is not my nature. I was cynical about these psychiatrists because they had got me sicker. And I didn't believe that this guy, but fifth psychiatrist, Dr. Perlman, another amazing thing about him was that, and I don't expect everybody to do this, Jim, but he, bless his heart, had office hours from 9 to 10 p.m. Monday through Thursday night. You could call him. So I'm in a panic, and I'm also cynical, and I don't believe him. And I call him up. I say, "Dr. Perlman, he's not working." He'd say, "We know what you have. Stay the course." Every time I call him, every night, "It's not working. We know what you have. Stay the course." And he was so confident in the diagnosis, he turned out to be right. But that actually really helped because
Wow.
because I was cynical and distrustful and all that stuff about the psychiatric profession.
So another reason for this podcast is because most people are not going to have a psychiatrist who acts like that.
Right.
And we want to use this opportunity to convey information that would help people arrive at that kind of reassurance without having Dr. Perlman to call up at 9 p.m.
Right.
So that the more you understand about what's happening, the more you can recognize yourself that, okay, this is like what Sarah's experience was. Maybe I am indeed getting better. Or, I'm having this side effect or that side effect. Should I stay the course? Or is this time to call to say, I think we need to change course?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I'm really so excited about this podcast, Jim, is because there's these massive swaths of what people call mental health deserts in this country. Most psychiatrists are on the coasts, and everything in between is, that you might drive 10 hours to find somebody. So we're really happy to have, I'm very grateful and happy that people can have access to your expertise in the show.
Thanks, Sarah. And so we should probably caution then that we will be taking questions. We will invite them by email, by any format that works for you. And we will then invite some folks to actually present those questions online here on the show. We won't necessarily be able to help everyone, and we regret that. But we hope to take questions that really illustrate common experiences. One question could help many people, we hope. So for this podcast today, how about a little more meat, a little more what did I learn today from listening to this? We talked about the most important idea being that there are non-manic versions of bipolar disorder where a full manic experience is not part of what people go through, that it's depression plus some other symptoms. So it's a spectrum of experience from fully manic to no manic symptoms whatsoever, and all sorts of people in between, thousands and thousands of people in between, so that waiting for a diagnosis of bipolar disorder can be a long wait for those people who are not fully manic because their symptoms are not dramatic enough to pull out this term, this bipolar term, which for many people is a sort of a scary idea. Bipolar disorder. Oh, that's a very much bigger deal than depression.
Yeah, according to Roger McIntyre of Toronto and a lot of folks, actually 2 out of 3 people with bipolar do not experience mania. 2/3. So that's a lot of folks that are flying below the radar, but can really benefit, as I have, and so many people, from bipolar-specific medications, bipolar-specific treatments, right?
Exactly.
So that's what's so key here. Millions of people.
So trying to find them, how can we help them to be found before they go through the 25 years that you had in order to get to a diagnosis and a treatment that worked for you. So we'll talk about numerous ways that that can be done. I think maybe for some meat today, one of the ways that that can be done is through a questionnaire that invites answers to those other questions that should be asked about a person's mood experience. I built this thing years ago and called it MoodCheck. And so the questions would be about your mood experience and then also about your family history, the age at which your mood problems began, the course of your illness, how bumpy is it, was there a postpartum change, and your experience on medications, particularly antidepressants. So that questionnaire, MoodCheck, is up on a couple of my websites. You can find that questionnaire in the links from this podcast as well.
Yeah, because when I've given talks, Jim, on other podcasts, TED Talk, et cetera, everybody wants to know, where can I find that diagnostic that you got from Jim Phelps that got you better? And I think that sometimes the way I frame it to people is, if you've been having devastating depressions and you're not getting better and you've tried everything for depression, consider this. You might actually be on the bipolar spectrum, as I am. And then what was it that was different? Okay, you had severe depressions. Then we added those 5 questions that you just said. Yes, mom and dad. Yes, early onset. Yes, and when I took antidepressants, got much worse, right? And the last one, I think, was really the slam dunk for my doctor, because if an antidepressant triggers mania or hypomania, that's, then he said, check box, we know what you have. I don't know if you would say it was that 100% of the time, but if it triggers mania, that's a good signal that, you actually got bipolar depression.
And now officially in the diagnostic rules from the American Psychiatric Association, that is true. If an antidepressant triggers mania and the mania lasts even after the antidepressant was discontinued, then yes, you do indeed have bipolar disorder.
I was getting up at 4 a.m. and writing, stuff that was getting published, and then, going for a run, and then up till midnight. Now, I was always high energy, but this was different. This was more, and my brother's calling me like, you're scaring me, and my husband's saying, you're awful irritable. But he liked it better because it was much better than when I was depressed, because depression was, I was dead on the couch and wanting to leave planet Earth.
If those symptoms did not continue after the antidepressant was stopped, that leaves an open question in many psychiatrists' minds. Is not so open in my mind, because that just doesn't happen to people with plain or pure depressions. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh gosh, you have bipolar disorder, you need to go on lamotrigine and maybe lithium. No, it means you pretty obviously you better be careful about getting another antidepressant. There's non-medication approaches to the treatment of mood disorders, including bipolar experience. So maybe we should really emphasize that non-medication approach and see how far we can get with that before we turn to any medication. For example, an emphasis on a regular bedtime and a regular rise time, so-called social rhythm therapy. The key portion of that is sleep onset and sleep offset. So when do you get in bed, when do you get out of bed? Let's go after that instead of a medication at all and see how far we can get. That's how I would be thinking for a person who had that one antidepressant induced, that was a really weird experience.
Okay. So you and I have a little bit of a disagreement on this one, I think, Jim. And again, I know I am a statistical sample of one. I'm not the whole world. But in my case, I'm religious about my good behaviors, what I call PECs, and we'll talk about them more later: physical, emotional, creative, and spiritual. But I feel like, and I've heard this from other people who live with bipolar, is that those good behaviors are preventative. Like, it'll keep me in a really good mood zone, and they're essential. But once I'm off the cliff, like one of our colleagues, Serena Goldsmith, she says, once I've hit the point of no return, in other words, I'm in a severe depressive episode, then for me, I don't think all those good behaviors in the world are going to get me better. It turned out I really need the medication to get me better. And I'm not a doctor, obviously, but I was thinking, I would suggest to someone that if you've tried all these antidepressants and then they triggered hypomania, good chance you've got, bipolar disorder. You could try and talk to your doctor, because you've told me, Jim, the mood stabilizers like lithium and lamotrigine, if they work, amen and hallelujah, it was brilliant, and you probably have a form of bipolar, and you're back from hell. It's awesome. If they don't work, they won't hurt you.
There are some risks that go with taking lamotrigine. The whole story about a allergic reaction, the rash, that happens to about one person in 2,000. So for example, what does 1 in 2,000 mean? That means that me, as a clinician interested particularly in complex mood disorders, I prescribed lamotrigine probably hundreds of times to someone who'd never had it before. It means that 1 in 2,000 of those people will get this horrible allergic reaction. I never actually saw that happen because I prescribed it hundreds of times, but not 2,000 times. So the point being, 1 in 2,000 is really, really uncommon.
Rare, yeah.
But it is a risk. And then with lithium, there are some risks there as well. And we can talk in more detail about what are the risks that go with lithium, what do you have to measure before you start it. But yes, I agree. Trying one of those medications after having had a bad experience on an antidepressant, the risks become about parallel.
Here's, I think, where the person who's been on the receiving end of these medications, lived experience, right? Like I talked to one guy, and I will not name him, a famous psychiatrist who's an academic, and he said, I don't have any fear. He said, I'm not afraid of prescribing antidepressants to my bipolar patients. And I took him aside and I said, you know what, babe, my friend, you should be afraid. Because let me tell you what it feels like. It feels like your brain is shaking within your skull and banging off your skull. So I think doctors who don't know and families don't know, oh, Prozac, it's like aspirin. Well, it's not.
Right.
It can have severe side effects. So
it's important, I think, as we go along, I'm going to hold my hands up and talk about two different poles, two different experiences. There are people who had wonderful responses to fluoxetine, Prozac, including me. When I was in my residency, I was having a horrible time in the first year of doing inpatient psychiatry work, horrible time. And after I tried 2 at least different psychotherapy approaches, somebody said, you might just try taking fluoxetine. So I did, and it was astounding. All of a sudden, I was just not having the struggle. I wasn't so angry all the time. I wasn't so frustrated all the time. Fortunately, I just, after a couple months, thought, yeah, okay, I'm over the hump. And I just, I don't think I'll refill it this time. And I just let it go. Well, I was lucky. That's one of the antidepressants that can taper itself off. So I didn't have a bad withdrawal experience, and I never had to go back on it again. It just helped me, and I managed to get off of it perhaps before I was on it so long that I would have developed a physiologic connection to it that could be severed when I stopped it, leading to withdrawal symptoms, which is a really common experience and can be horrible. There are some people who benefit tremendously and get a great outcome, and then there's some people for whom, bad idea, wish we would never have gone there, and lots of intermediate experience as well.
So I think just back to the key point here is that if you've been living with devastating depression, nothing's working, or you got triggered into mania, consider that you might live on the bipolar spectrum. Ask your psychiatrist or your doctor about a mood stabilizer like lithium or lamotrigine. I wrote this book, Jim, that you talked about and and we can say more about that. I love the cover, BrainStorm. But I had a mom once of a 21-year-old say she brought it to the doctor and said, look, page 72, this is what I think my kid has. So that you can advocate for yourself. People fear bipolar. And what I want to tell people, I have a lot of, young moms of young children, because the onset is often 21, 22, 23. So they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they know my story, and they'll come to me kind of devastated, and I'll say, this is great news. Congratulations, he or she has, or they have a diagnosis, because bipolar is really treatable once you know it. And there's a lot you can do personally to make a difference in your own care and recovery and prevention. So good news. And I don't mean that really tongue in cheek. I want people to understand that it's helpful to have that diagnosis, not scary.
Sarah, could you say a few words about the film version, the film experience that you've gotten into, coming from the book to a documentary, we hope for public television, about the whole BrainStorm experience?
Yeah, I feel extremely privileged and grateful to have a world-class science documentarian, Bonnie Walsh, as our director and producer, take on this project, whose mission is to crush the stigma and maximize healing and save lives by helping people understand that there is indeed a bipolar spectrum. And we're doing this, crushing the stigma to some extent, by highlighting these amazing people who live with bipolar, as well as getting into the brain science and breakthrough treatments. So it's the people, the science, and the treatments, and together it's really a whole. Very exciting. And we're thrilled to be able to feature those folks on this podcast. We'll be featuring, as guests on the show, some of the people with lived experience, that's folks who live with bipolar, some scientists who are at the cutting edge of brain research, and some clinicians who are using some really breakthrough treatments. So that's cool. We're going to have them all on the show, and you're going to have an opportunity to write in with your questions. We want to reiterate 3 points that we hope to make on this first episode, and that is, number one, 2/3 of people with bipolar do not experience mania. Indeed, there is bipolar without mania.
And secondly, diagnosis can be really tricky because the features of that hypomania, the not fully manic, can be so subtle. But when diagnosis is correct, treatment can be tremendously helpful.
And third is that the right treatment can absolutely save lives. And your own input into those treatments, the wellness practices that you do, make a huge difference. And we're going to introduce you to a whole bunch of those on future episodes.
So thank you very much for being with us for this first episode of our podcast. We hope that it's been of use to you and perhaps somewhat entertaining. And we hope to continue to do that together, Sara and I.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, Jim, to you. And thank you to our producer, Luke Medalla, and to our director and producer of our film, Bonnie Walsh, BrainStorm the film that's coming up in 2025. Thank you so much for joining us, and over and out.
Thanks so much for joining us on BrainTalk, our bipolar spectrum podcast. BrainTalk is a program of BrainStorm, a multi-platform project about the bipolar spectrum, which includes Sara Schley's memoir and a full-length documentary coming in 2025. We aim to save lives, crush stigma, and maximize healing for all people living with bipolar and those who love them. For more information, head to www.brainstormthefilm.com. To call in to a future episode and ask questions, go to brainstormthefilm.com/podcasts.